Hello, everyone. I will have a conversation today about quantum physics, about reality and consciousness with my dear teacher and friend of mine, Professor Jan RAK. Hello, Jan. Nice to see you again.
Hello, Dobrosława, and hello, everybody.
My name is Dobrosława Kwiatkowska, and we have met with Jan, I think it was 5 years ago in Poznan.
That's right.
Time is running fast. And then our paths crossed several times, mostly in Germany, in Frankfurt am Main, in Bad Nauheim, I think also in Berlin.
I think so too. Right?
Yes, and 1 year ago, Professor RAK was a guest and a dear speaker of our conference, the conference for the information and energy medicine, which took place in Poznan on 11th January 2020.
It was a beautiful event.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering, how do you remember this event actually?
Yeah, you know, I remember that, you know, the place was very beautiful. I met a lot of very interesting people. And I think I am with some of them, I'm still in contact, not only with you, obviously, but also with the other people, you know, they were, but I'm very poor in remembering the names, you know, but
Happens.
That's right, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, it was very interesting, right?
It's good to hear that. Please allow that I will introduce you, because a lot of people in Poland already know you. But for some of them who don't, I will just say a few, I think, important things. I was actually thinking, what should I say about you, because there is so much. First of all, I think it's important to say that you have some kind of double path. So on the one hand, you are, and let me not spoil that, you are ultra relativistic nuclear physicist.
Very nice, fantastic, right?
Thank you. And you are at the university in Finland, which name I'm not able to pronounce correctly, forgive me.
Right, that's the University of Jyväskylä.
Jyväskylä, thank you.
Right.
I couldn't read that, but now when I pronounce it, when you help me, is better. So Jyväskylä University, I know that you were also participated in many major experiments, accelerator experiments, as an experimentalist all over the world. What else? I think it's very important to say that you are a project leader of the Finnish participation at the ALICE program, right, at the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland.
Yeah, I used to be till last year. Now, you know, younger people took over. You know.
Okay, but you did it for a long time, as I remember.
Right.
And on the other hand, you like the, let's say, different approach, still scientific approach, but an approach who allows you to see more behind the curtain, let's say. I have read that you are very active in some kind of research regarding the gravitation and all anomalies around the gravitation. And you also are very interested in consciousness in general.
That's right. you know, I think my major interest is to understand what is the consciousness and what is the reality, so to speak, right? And I was, you know, as a physicist, I think as a scientist from this physics field, there is a, you know, a good opportunity to touch upon some fundamental aspects of what the reality is, right? Yes. As a physicist, we are trying to understand what the matter is, what are the major interactions which are keeping the matter, so to speak, together, right? And as you mentioned, right, besides the gravity, there is also an electromagnetism and the strong force, weak force, right? And you know, all this except the gravity is based on quantum physics, quantum mechanics, and in the relativistic version, it's called quantum field theory, right? Mm-hmm. And now, you know, this quantum physics, already some 100 years ago or so, you know, bring up on the surface the philosophical questions like, you know, can we really decouple observed reality from the observer, right? Is it somehow only a kind of illusion that we are observing something outside us, and so on and so forth, right? So then the consciousness kind of research is very deeply rooted to the basic of the quantum physics, as maybe probably a lot of people already know. And, you know, when I was kind of trying to dive in more deep, then I kind of discovered some interesting phenomenon which maybe you and other people will be also familiar with, and it's related to the fact that if you believe in something, right, I call it belief system, and if you really open-mindedly, if you really exercise your open mind and try to understand what the reality is, then you, at some point, you will realize that your belief system is going to, you know, to shatter, or is going to kind of completely decay, right? Kind of to. So, in this way, somehow I started to be very interested in alternative views in physics, which brought me to the field of dynamic gravity and electromagnetism. You know, there are some exciting projects where I'm involved with, which, you know, I think in the context of the current period, what we are experiencing, you know, this pandemic and so on, it's amazing that it seems to be that you know, this era kind of open new doors back into this you know, alternative ideas. I think nowadays we can more openly speak about projects which were what was impossible, for example, like 5 or 10 years ago, right? Yes. Related to, you know.
I absolutely agree. I remember you coming back to the beliefs you were talking about. I remember you once telling me, it was I think already 3 years ago in Frankfurt, that I shouldn't open any letter from the, let's say, any, yes, right. Steueramt. I don't know the name in English, Steueramt.
Tax office.
Tax office, when I strongly believe it's something what I will not like. And I remember that, and I use it all the time.
Look, that's interesting. That's interesting example. I think, obviously, you know, the mainstream physicists don't like this kind of stretch, right? It's a little bit of stretch, but on the other side, you know, in this quantum physics, you can really see that the things do not exist until someone observed them, right? That's the principle of this quantum wave function, and this is actually still kind of the things which nobody understands exactly how the consciousness, so to speak, interacts with this wave function and cause the collapse of that wave function, which generates the information about the reality. So in my view, I believe that the reality, what we observe, these are not a real object, solid kind of or whatever, but these are rather informations which are registered by consciousness, right? And this story with the letter is actually, you know, the same. You know, we are saying that the quantum physics is kind of something which is interesting only for people in laboratory or so, but on the other side, we are all from the quantum particles, and the world is obeying kind of the quantum rules. And this example with the letter from the taxation office is, I think, is very useful, and many people know that intuitively, right? That if you are faced with some situation which you can react, let's say later, you can postpone your reaction. That's always much better to wait and react only when your consciousness vibration or state is higher, because then, right, it's elevated. So because then the result of that situation will correspond to that level of consciousness, right? So
exactly.
And look, the point is that some people might, you know, saying that that's what are you speaking about, but everybody can try, and everybody will see the result, right?
That's right, and make this experience, because I did such an experience many times in my life. It was not only this situation with any letter, and that's why, because I experienced that, I integrated that. So I don't need to only believe your words. But
right,
me,
absolutely.
I was wondering was it always your approach? What I mean, because you are known as a scientist who perfectly combines, on the one hand, dry knowledge, let's say, physics, quantum physics, with very deep research about consciousness, and you even combined it with spirituality. Was it right. Always like that?
Look, I think I have been always, the whole my career, I was always attracted to the spiritual aspect of reality. Okay. And I read many books about, kind of Buddhism and kind of this Oriental, kind of this ancient philosophers and so on. And obviously it kind of influenced me and motivated me, right? That's clear. But on the other side, the pure physics, as you said, the dry science, right? So the scientists cannot actually avoid the spirituality as well. If I speak about kind of the mainstream science, right, which is based on this 3 or 4 kind of major in physics, right? The major physics theory, that's the theory of relativity, right? Special relativity, then the general relativity, which is the gravity kind of, and then this quantum mechanics and quantum field theory, right? So, and if you use kind of this as a framework where you want to describe the reality, then there are tons and thousands of unresolved questions, puzzles. Big Bang, is the cosmos arising from some singularity, and what's happened before the singularity, and you know, and how the consciousness actually reacts with the quantum functions and so. So to my opinion, if you are really open-minded, you know, fair scientist, then you know you must admit that there are many unknown. Look, you are from this medicine kind of area, right?
Yes, exactly.
And look, if you say, you know, there are some there is some disease or, you know, some problem which is no one can cure, right? Like the cancer or something like that, right? Is that true or not, right? Probably for 99% of people it might be true, but there are always exceptions, you know, people surviving some
exceptions. Yes,
you see, and if you say one exception, it's so what does it mean if there is one exception? You see,
yes. You can never predict. You can never predict. You can never say one-to-one everyone with allergy will be cured in 10 days.
Right.
There's so many options.
My interpretation of all of that, what we were speaking about, is that there is, it's maybe slightly too much for many people, but my interpretation is that there is really no objective reality, right? And somehow what we are experiencing, the kind of this holographic mental picture of what we think we are living in, is rather a superposition kind of, you know, of you know, many subjective realities, you know, and in that way, you know, it coincides very nicely also with this Asian philosophy, you know, Buddhism and whatever, that we are actually creating our own reality ourselves, right? Which is very important distinction, because I think if you believe in the objective and independent world, then you are a victim of circumstances which are happening outside, right? But if you switch and if you accept that it might be slightly different, which is not just belief, you know, because I am speaking about scientific facts, right? We can, you know, this quantum physics is not any kind of belief, you know, there are many facts which are undermining the belief that the reality is objective, right? Then if you accept this view, then what's happened is that instead of a victim, right, of this objective circumstances, you are finally a creator of your circumstances, right? And I think that's very important.
And we have been talking about that. Remember 1 month ago, I think, because you are also my teacher at the existential, existential consciousness in the research institute. And I remember during your lecture, it was, I think, the end of April or something like that. We have been discussing this interconnectedness that on the one hand, we are connected with everything and everyone, what means that we all are co-creators. So I do create it, you created for yourself, I created for myself, but there are a lot of points which meet, okay? So we are all co-creating, and we are all also in process of becoming. We are still in process. Life is in process. But I wanted to ask you one more thing, especially nowadays. What do you think that is important that people make this switch? And under switch, I remember to realize that we really are connected with each other, that my action means something also for you and for anyone else. Why is it important? First question, because then I have the second one connected with that.
Look, I think that this what we are the era, the time, right? What we are experiencing now, to my opinion, is absolutely enlightening, and it's a very beautiful era. Also, I apologize, and I understand all the people who are on different opinions, right?
Of course.
I understand that many people suffer and so on, but you know, this, what is happening now, actually, you know, very, you know, nice, how to say, I don't want to say nicely, you know, but it really demonstrates what we were speaking about, right? Because
Yes.
now you can see, and I have realized that many people are starting aware of the fact that the society is really somehow splitting, you know, that many people are living this pandemic disaster, right?
Yeah.
And many other people also kind of sharing the same planet and the same reality, right? They don't have any, you know, pandemic in our world, right? So and I don't know, I don't want to really touch up on some feeling of people
Yes,
who are
of
really,
course, but
you see,
and exactly what do you think it's important now that we understand, that people understand that the fact, or let's say for maybe other people, the hypothesis, okay, that we are
right,
co-creating, that it's extremely important now in this moment on the planet.
right. Look, all philosophers, especially the ancient philosopher, you know, Zen Buddhist and so on, they will tell you, you know, it's yes and no at the same time, you know. So, and from my point of view, it's very easy, right, to understand and to answer your question, and at the same time it's very difficult, right? And the easy and difficult, what I mean, look, it's so easy to accept that you are a creator of your own reality, including everything, you know, including the disease, you know, including troubles, including the happiness, including pandemic, including the summertime, you know, everything. And once you, if you are able to accept that, which requires really some courage, right? And you have to take your
as well,
and the responsibility, right? So you cannot blame anybody else than yourself, right? So if you have this courage and responsibility, it's really very easy, you know. Let's you know, take all the you know, what's happened is my kind of projection of the inner state, and then you will see how the reality responds, right? So if you accept this, so I mean, my main message is that actually the answer, what is most important in current days, my answer is kind of understand that it is your kind of, you are the creator of what is going on, and you can change it, and you can do whatever you like, you know. If you like to, you know, pandemic and all this miserable happening, then it's fine, right? And I respect, you know.
Yes.
But if you like the good health, right, to be outside, enjoy the sunshine, you know, then nothing can really happen to you, but it needs a courage, right, to accept that.
A courage and the switch, I think also to remember that our perception is very much involved. Not only, I don't mean now only perception, that what you do consciously. I mean also all perceptive processes which are underconsciously done.
Right. Look, I think, yes,
please.
Finish it, please.
You are my guest.
No, so I just wanted to, you know, to react to exactly that, you know, because many people are fooled with what is good and what is bad. You know, we have this habit to differentiate, you know, that this happening is good, I like it, and this happening is bad, I don't like it, right? But is this distinction, is it kind of reasonable or not? I think if you really think more deeply, you will find that nothing is good and nothing is bad. Everything is as it should be, right? But you can focus in your mind, you know, you can allow only those thoughts which are in line with what do you want. You know, that's very important. If you focus on things which you don't want, right, then you create subconsciously the reality which creates the thing which you don't want, because it's related to your focus, right? If you you know, and that's, now we can go, what does it mean practically, right? Watching TV, you know, some bad news, and reading this, and you know, discussing with people about troubles and problems. Sure, sometimes it's not possible to avoid, but I think clever people, wise people are always focusing on the aspects of whatever which are in line of what they would like to have in their reality, right? But why should I, when I see the car accident, why should I stop and take pictures and kind of, let's say, you know, accept and absorb every details of that accident? You know, what can be the results of that, right? So it's this thing we have discussed, I think, requires also a discipline. You know, we said courage, responsibility, and the discipline, right?
I absolutely agree. Let's say 90%. The one thing what I cannot say I'm not, I don't agree, but I just have it in my consideration, and I think often about that. And it is, on the one hand, we have polarization, and is that what you are talking about? That things in the universe are like night and day, and man and woman, and let's say warm and cold. But on the other hand, and I don't know if you know this philosopher Armin Risi. He is from Switzerland. Marcus knows him very well. And he wrote a book, We Are Light Beings. It's translated in Polish, in German available. And he wrote about exactly that what you are saying, but he said there are also dualities, and there are things which are bad because we feel in us as a human beings, when we are healthy and not psychologically somehow with problems, we feel the difference when someone is beating a child and someone is holding a child. We have response in us, and we know, and it's not connected only with our experiences. It's like our core is feeling, our core is hurting. And these are, he said, dualities, which we cannot say it's okay beating a child as holding him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know, but you know, sure, I understand.
We had such discussions many times, remember?
Right. But
conference, and it's important to discuss about that, I think.
Yeah, sure. But look, philosophically, kind of speaking, yes, I think that the duality, right? Everything stems from neutral, from nothing, right? That's the, you know, that's the consciousness, yes, this me, I am, you know, that's I, you know, that's the emptiness without any form, without anything, but only with the kind of only, that everything is their potential, right? And it is all you know, kind of creation of of the same thing, but how that reality or everything is created by duality, right? So you have this neutral nothing, which is splits in light and darkness, right? Or in good and bad, you know, evil and whatever, right? So, and that's the point, you know. So whatever is, that's the part of this yen, right? I yen, right? That this other, you know, and that's in a way, it's the intelligent, is the ratio, is that these are the thinking, you know. That's and nowadays we can see that it's actually the, you know, the way how the artificial intelligence works. It's very close to what we think the consciousness is, right?
But
that's also
it's close. But as we both know, there is the situation where human created the artificial intelligence, but I didn't hear about the situation where the artificial intelligence created a human being.
Yeah, look, sure. Look, I will be more cautious here, you know. So any, you know, that's kind of other chapter, right? But any technology, right, we have developed, right, is manifesting our abilities, what we already have, right? So, and the artificial intelligence in a way manifests also, to my opinion, how our brain works, right? This neural network, what the people are using in the computer is kind of so interesting. That's very interesting, right? That it can really reproduce a lot of what the human brain does, including emotions, you know, pattern recognition, whatever, right? So
we have to be very careful with that, you know. This, I think,
sure, absolutely. To my opinion, to my opinion, it's much more danger in a way than the nuclear weapons, right?
Yes.
But on the other side, again, right? If the subjective reality is the only what we are, what is real, then if you have a fear, right, then you will create the future which might reflect your fears, and that's always like that, right? So from my perspective, it's nothing wrong with artificial intelligence, and it's only showing us how the brain probably, you know, works. I'm not saying that. The question is whether these machines will be ever able to be conscious, right? That's the frequently asked question, and I think that, again, who knows, right? Who knows?
Who knows? I will come back to holographic reality for a while, because I remember you saying about holographic reality many times, and I remember also Professor Erwin Laszlo talking about. I really respect him and his approach, while he's saying that the thing is what is happening to us. Yes, actually, we have to be aware that what is happening to me is happening to every one of us, like in a hologram. Yes, the information is its part. Tell me a little bit more about your view. You started with that a few minutes ago, but you didn't continue that. About the holographic idea for the people who are not physicists. So simple words.
Look, I think the holographic idea was kind of invented, you know, century ago. David Bohm, I think, was one of the biggest proponent of but there are many other people. And nowadays, I think, even in the mainstream kind of science, the holographic is slightly different version, not directly connected to consciousness, but this idea of holographic universe is also kind of very popular, right? You know, that's so interesting, right? So suggestive that what we are experiencing is a holographic mental picture is that if you really think what the hologram really is, you know, so if you take a normal photograph, let's say, if you take a picture of your family, right, then you take the picture and every pixel of that photograph represents some particular you know, details of this scene which has been shooted. So you can see that every pixel contains some information about particular fact, right? And if you if you take out this one single pixel from that picture, right, then it will be just some value, right, of colors or so, but and you will have no idea what the original photograph was about, right? So, and if you, and one can, everybody knows that very well. If you take the picture photographs and scissors and you cut off, you know, a little piece, it depends how big the piece is. But if it's very small, you have no clue what was the original picture, right? If it's large enough, you know, if you cut just half, you might have chance, right? And now let's speak about the holographic photograph, you know, so it's the same thing. You have some objective, right? And then you take a kind of photograph, which is also saved in a way in some pixels, right? But now the every pixel, you know, and now it's done in a way that the every pixel of that photograph does not contain only the corresponding color of the scenes you are shooting, but also it's exposed to the reference and to the reference light, which is also containing the information about the phase between the two beams of what you see and the reference beam, right? It's kind of, you know, so you have one more dimensions in the information, not only the intensity of the light, but also the phase, you know, with respect to the reference beam. And the results of that is that every pixel, the results of that is first, that if you look at this kind of holographic photograph by naked eye, you will see only the chaotic somehow, you know, you will not recognize anything. It doesn't look as, you know, it doesn't reflect the reality for your naked eye. You will not see anything, right? Some, you know, chaotic patterns which you will not understand. But if you then expose this photograph by the coherent light again, then you will see not only the picture of the reality of the scene, but you will see it in more dimensions, right? So you will see it in 3D, not in as in the photograph. That's the hologram. But the point is that every, let's say, pixel of that holographic photograph contains the whole scene, right? The everything. So if you take a scissors again and you chop, you know, you cut out the small piece of that and you enlight that with the coherent beam again, then you will see again the whole thing, a little bit blurry. Not all the details will be, you know, visible. It will be slightly, but you will see always the whole picture. And I think this is so suggestive, you know, that everyone, you know, is kind of from us is a part of this holographic photographs. And, you know, and if you change one pixel somehow, you know, if you can manipulate one pixel, then this information will, you know, reflects in and will propagate to the whole universe, right? So there is no information which can be say has no influence to anything else, you know. So like, you understand, right? So
of course, I remember this sentence of Rumi that actually we are not a drop in an ocean. we are an ocean in a drop.
Right. So everybody, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
And everybody has a own copy of the whole universe with every other beings, with everything, right? So that's the universe. And the other interesting point, you know, of this hologram is that if you think how your body works, right? How your brain, so you are seeing some, you know, using your eyes to see the light from outside, right? You are experience your senses, you know, you hear something and so and what's happened with these signals from outside, right? So they are translated inside your brain into electrochemical signals in this neural network, right? And they are, in a sense, in the brain, you know, what the brain sees, you know, many signals from your eyes, from your ears, from your fingertips, from whatever, right? And inside your brain, right, there is an interference of these signals, but these are, you know, but they have no kind of meaning, in a sense. They would look like to you, if you can do a snapshot of somebody's brain alive, right, which is kind of impossible, then you will see this interference of many signals with the signals from your brain, which are already information which are inside, you know. But there is this picture of that I see beautiful lady as you, or you know, something outside. Where is this mental picture coming from, right? And to the opinion of these people, proponents of this holographic universe, the way how we see this qualia, this reality building bridges, right? Look, you see, for example, that this object has some color and it's red, right? So how you can, you know, but inside your brain it's nothing like red color, right? It's just this number, right? Frequency, some frequency and number. And you know, and this proponent are kind of believing, including myself, that consciousness itself has this, you know, ability to do a Fourier this is called Fourier transform, right? From this, you know, vibration pattern inside your brain, and then it generates the holographic kind of picture of, you know, what is represented only in numbers. So you understand a little what I mean? So
yes,
only,
I understand that.
right.
That's why I think we should look at our men, or you at your wife, yes, very differently, because you have a hologram,
Right.
and to adjust it, we have to just make like in our cell phones actualization.
Right.
Do I understand it right?
Look, but, sure. But the point, you know, the main point I want to emphasize here, that's the real, so the kind of real reality is nothing like beautiful world around, you know, planets, stars, you know, beautiful garden around. The reality, you know, the reality is just this holographic photograph, which are just numbers, right? It's the, you know, like this in this Matrix movie, you know, where these numbers are kind of, you know, slipping down from, you know, from the top to the bottom of the monitor, right? So to my opinion, the reality is something like that, which is watched, you know, by consciousness somehow without our heads, which is able to represent these numbers by holographic mental picture. That's what I wanted.
You know that I love to discuss with you, and we could discuss 1 more hour for sure.
Sure.
Time is running fast. Tell me one more thing short, because the next conference will be in October. the next conference of the Information and Energy Medicine in Poland. We will have it on the 10th of October 2021 in Poznań. And you already accepted my invitation, and I'm very happy of that, and I appreciate it very, very much, because people loved your lecture, and until now some of them are asking me if you will be there. So it was a great idea, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity to have you on our stage. But tell me, do you already know what do you want to share with us in October, or what do you think is important to share nowadays? Because we are, as you said, in a phase of changes on our planet. What will be important from your point of view to share?
Yes, first of all, I thank you also for the invitation. So that's very nice meeting. So I'm really looking forward. And I think that the quantum physics and kind of all the philosophy related to consciousness, what I'm speaking about, I believe that it can kind of suggest to people how to cope, with the situation they are dealing with, on the everyday basis, right? So, sure, I don't want to, teach people, the mathematical structure of quantum, but that's my focus is, and that's, I think, the most important thing anyway, That's why I kind of changed the direction of my scientific career a little bit, because I think it's interesting maybe whether the universe was born 13.8 billion years ago, or maybe 13.9 billion years ago. It's I'm not saying it's not interesting, but I think the most interesting things stemming from the science should be able to kind of help us with our lives, right? With our everyday basis, right? So that would be focus of my lecture there, on what we can really learn from concurrent science about how to cope with the situation we are dealing with.
I absolutely agree, and we can't wait. Sounds wonderful, because people are coming to such an event. I think also for some kind of inspiration, how they can use it on a daily basis, not only, as I said before, dry theory, and you combined it.
Right.
You combined it. So thank you very much for your warm presence, for your wonderful ability to share this complicated topic, which is quantum physics, with people, so they can be closer to that. And what can I wish you for the summertime? Tell me, what do you wish yourself for this coming summer?
I don't think I have some wishes, because I'm already so happy, you see.
It's good to hear that. It's good to hear.
Right.
That. I'm happy for you as well.
Right, and I thank you, Dobrosława, a lot for organizing these meetings, and I think it's very important what you are doing. So thank you a lot, and I'm looking forward to meet you in person and to meet all other people in your event.
Thank you very much. Greetings for your wonderful wife, and we will see definitely in October in Poznań.
Thank you, Dobrosława.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And for everyone who are watching us, if you are interested in our conference of Information and Energy Medicine in Poland, 10th October 2021, you can find the information or on our Facebook of Polskie Towarzystwo Medycyny Informacyjnej i Energetycznej, or below our interview. Thank you for the time and see you next time. Bye bye.
See you. Bye bye.
See you.